The glass walls of the Sterling Global headquarters overlooked the London skyline like a cold, indifferent eye. I stood by the window, adjusting the cufflink of my bespoke suit. My life was measured in stock prices, hostile takeovers, and the crushing weight of my family's expectations. "Sir, the merger files from the boutique design firm are here," my secretary said, placing a tablet on the mahogany desk. I didn't look. "Just give me the summary, Peter. The lead designer is a freelancer, a man named Miller. He's highly recommended, but he had a condition for the meeting. He has to leave by 4 p.m. every day for personal reasons." I scoffed. Personal reasons? In this industry? Tell him. I stopped. My eyes had finally drifted to the tablet. There was a photo attached to the freelancer's profile. The world stopped spinning. The face staring back at me was thinner than I remembered. The soft, youthful glow was replaced by a sharp, tired elegance. But those eyes, wide, soulful, and brimming with a secret sorrow, belonged to the Omega I had lost 4 years ago. James, the boy I was forced to leave when my father threatened to ruin his family. The boy I had spent every night trying to forget with the help of expensive scotch and long hours. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He's in the lobby, sir. He just arrived for the briefing." I didn't wait for him to say another word. I took the stairs, not waiting for the elevator to open, my alpha pheromones flaring with a sudden, uncontrollable intensity that made the employees in the hallway shrink back against the walls. I burst into the lobby. He was sitting on the edge of a sleek leather chair, clutching a portfolio. He looked out of place in the sterile, corporate opulence of my world. When he looked up and saw me, his face went deathly pale. "Mark," he breathed. I didn't say a word. I grabbed his wrist, intending to drag him into my private office to demand where he had been for 4 years. But before I could speak, a small weight hit my thigh. "Hey, let go of my papa." I froze. I looked down. A small boy, no older than 4, was glaring up at me. He had my exact jawline. He had the same stubborn set to his shoulders that I saw in the mirror every morning. He was wearing a tiny backpack with a cartoon tiger on it, and his small hands were balled into fists, his scent, a faint, budding alpha ozone, beginning to spike in protection of his father. "Troy!" James gasped, reaching down to pull the boy back. "Troy, stay behind me." I looked from the boy to James, my heart hammering a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The math was simple. The timing was undeniable. "Mark, please," James whispered, his voice trembling as he shielded the child. "We're just here for the job. We don't want any trouble." "The job," I repeated, my gaze locked on the boy who looked like a miniature version of my own soul. "You think I care about the job right now?" I knelt down so I was eye level with the child. Up close, the resemblance was terrifying. The boy didn't flinch. He bared his small teeth at me, protecting his Omega. "What's your name, kid?" I asked, my voice softening in a way that would have shocked my board of directors. "I'm Troy Sterling," the boy said defiantly. Sterling. James had given him my family name. I looked up at James, who was now trembling visibly, tears brimming in his eyes. "For years, James," I said, standing up slowly, my shadow falling over both of them. "You've been raising a Sterling Alpha in secret for 4 years? He's mine," James snapped, his maternal instinct overcoming his fear. "He's my son. You chose the company, remember? You chose this building. You don't get him too." I looked around the lobby. My employees were staring. My life was an open book of discipline and order, and it had just been set on fire by a 4-year-old in a tiger backpack. "Peter," I shouted, not taking my eyes off the boy. "Yes, sir?" My secretary stammered, running over. "Cancel my meetings. Cancel the merger." I stepped closer, my scent wrapping around them like an iron velvet cloak. "I'm taking the day off." The words settled like a final verdict. James shook his head immediately. "No, Mark. We're not going anywhere with you. We're just going to talk. Nothing else." "There's nothing to talk about," James said, his voice tight. "There's a lot to talk about," I replied evenly. "You just showed up with my son. You hid him from me for years. Do you still think there's nothing to talk about? James swallowed. Then let's go somewhere open, a restaurant. We can talk there. An open space means him ending up on the news, I said quietly. And I don't think you want that. Do you? The lobby suddenly felt too small, too exposed, too loud for something this fragile. My penthouse is across the river, I continued. No employees, no board members, just us. James hesitated. I could see the war in his expression, the instinct to run battling the weight of 4 years of silence pressing down on him. Then he closed his eyes. Not for long, he said at last. This time it sounded less like a condition and more like a shield. After that, we go. I inclined my head. That's fair. I stepped back, deliberately giving him space. No touch, no pressure. Control wasn't about force. It never had been. We'll take my car, I added. You can sit in the back with him. James studied my face for a long moment, searching for reassurance, for regret, for the man he once knew. Then he nodded. The car ride was a capsule of silent, charged tension. My driver, Henry, didn't so much as glance in the rearview mirror as Troy pressed his face against the window, watching London blur by. James sat stiffly beside him, one arm around our son's shoulders, his gaze fixed on the passing city as if memorizing an escape route. Our son. The words echoed in my skull, a seismic fact rearranging my entire reality. My penthouse was a masterpiece of architectural silence. It was all gray marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, and furniture that looked more like modern art than something you'd actually sit on. It was a home designed for a man who didn't plan on staying awake long enough to enjoy it. It was not a home for a 4-year-old. Don't touch that, Troy, James whispered for the 10th time, his voice tight with anxiety. He hovered over the boy, who was currently eyeing a $50,000 crystal sculpture on the coffee table as if it were a target. Troy didn't look impressed by the luxury. He looked like he wanted to find a place to nap, and this cold, shiny apartment wasn't it. He can touch whatever he wants, I said, leaning against the kitchen island. I had discarded my suit jacket and rolled up my sleeves, but I still felt like a predator trying to act like a host. Everything in this room belongs to him anyway. James flinched. He finally looked at me, his eyes sharp with a bitterness he had earned over 4 lonely years. He doesn't want your statues, Mark. He wants his bed. He wants the life we had before you stormed into that lobby and ruined our peace. Peace. I stepped forward, the alpha in me pacing behind my ribs. You are living in a studio apartment the size of my walk-in closet, James. I saw the address on your tax forms. You were working 3 freelance jobs just to pay for his preschool. And we were happy, James snapped. We didn't have a sterling family name hanging over our heads like a guillotine. He was safe. He's a sterling alpha, I growled, my voice dropping an octave. He was never going to be safe in the shadows. His scent is already starting to change. Do you think other alphas wouldn't notice a child with my bloodline unprotected in the city? Troy suddenly looked up from the sculpture. He walked over to me, his small feet silent on the silk rug. He stopped just inches away, staring up at me with a look of pure, unadulterated judgment. You're loud, the boy said. I blinked, completely caught off guard. I had negotiated billion-dollar deals with the most terrifying men in Europe, yet this child made me feel like I was the one being interrogated. I'm sorry, I stammered. Are you the boss of this house? Troy asked, tilting his head. I am. Then why is there no food? Papa says bosses provide. He crossed his small arms, the tiger backpack shifting on his shoulders. I want pancakes, with the chocolate chips. Do you have them? I looked at James, bewildered. I hadn't used my stove in 3 years. My fridge contained 3 bottles of vintage champagne and some high-end sparkling water. He hasn't eaten since lunch, James said, his expression softening just a fraction at his son's boldness. I'll go to the store. Just let us leave. No, I grabbed my phone and tapped a few buttons on a private concierge app. The best chef in the city is 3 blocks away. He'll be here in 10 minutes with enough pancakes to fill this entire floor. Troy narrowed his eyes, clearly weighing the pros and cons of staying with the loud man versus getting chocolate chip pancakes. Okay, he decided. But I want to watch TV. An hour later, the sterile silence of my penthouse was shattered. The smell of expensive cologne was replaced by the scent of maple syrup and fried batter. Troy was sprawled on my Italian leather sofa, his sticky fingers leaving prints on the remote as he searched for cartoons. I sat at the dining table watching them. James was sitting next to the boy, carefully cutting the pancakes into small bites. He looked so natural, so grounded, while I felt like a stranger in my own life. "Why didn't you tell me, James?" I asked softly, the question finally breaking through the surface. "After my father stepped down, after I took over the board, you could have come to me." James didn't look up. He watched our son eat. "Your father told me that if I ever contacted you, he would make sure I lost my parental rights. He said a designer Omega wasn't fit to raise a sterling heir." He finally looked at me, and the pain in his silver eyes was blinding. "I wasn't protecting myself, Mark. I was protecting him from your father." A heavy silence settled over us, broken only by the sound of a cartoon tiger laughing on the giant screen. My phone suddenly buzzed on the table. It was a restricted number. I knew that vibration. "Don't answer it," James whispered, sensing the shift in my energy. I looked at the screen. Chairman Sterling. My father. The man who had lied to me. The man who had threatened the person I loved. I looked at Troy, who was currently laughing at the TV, a smear of chocolate on his cheek. He was my son. He was the future of the Sterling Empire. And he was currently the most dangerous secret in London. I let the phone ring until it went silent. "He's going to find out," James said, his voice trembling. "By tomorrow morning. The news that the CEO cleared a whole floor for a freelancer, and a child will be everywhere." I stood up and walked over to the sofa. I reached out, and for the first time, I let my hand rest on Troy's dark hair. The boy leaned into my touch instinctively, his alpha instinct recognizing the bond even if his mind didn't. "Let him find out," I said, my gaze hardening. "I spent 4 years building this empire so I would never have to follow his orders again. If he wants my heir, he has to go through me." James and Troy ended up staying for the night. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. While Troy slept sprawled across my silk sheets, looking tiny and invincible in the dinosaur pajamas I'd ordered Peter to buy, and James rested fitfully on the edge of the bed, I stood in the living room, watching the city lights. I eventually slept on the couch. I didn't want the guest room. The guest room felt too far away from them. The calm didn't last long. At 7 a.m., my private elevator chimed. I didn't need to check the security camera to know who it was. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt heavy, charged with an old, oppressive alpha scent that smelled like bitter tobacco and stagnant water. The doors slid open. My father, Mr. Sterling, stepped out. He didn't look like a man who had just flown in from Jeju. He looked like a king arriving to reclaim a lost province. "I heard a rumor," he started, without even bothering to greet me. His voice a gravelly rasp as he leaned on his silver-headed cane. "A rumor that my son has turned his office into a daycare and brought a stray Omega into his home." I stepped into his path, blocking the hallway to the master bedroom. "He isn't a stray, and the child is your grandson. Not that you deserve to use that word." My father's eyes narrowed as he looked past me toward the closed bedroom door. "A grandson?" he scoffed. "You mean a liability? You think the board will respect a leader who was tricked by an Omega for 4 years? You think the stock price will hold when they find out the heir to the Sterling Group was raised in a gutter? He was raised with love." A voice snapped from behind me. I turned. James was standing there. He looked exhausted, his hair messy, but his eyes were blazing. He was clutching Troy's small tiger backpack to his chest like a shield. "Ah," my father sneered, his gaze raking over James with pure disgust. "The designer. I thought I paid you enough to disappear forever." "You paid me to stay away from your son," James said, his voice shaking but firm. "But you can't pay me to erase my child's blood. Mark knows the truth now. Your threats don't work anymore." The bedroom door creaked open. Troy stood there, rubbing his eyes with small fists. He looked at the strange old man with the cane, then at James's pale face. The 4-year-old's instincts kicked in instantly. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He walked straight to James and grabbed his hand, his tiny alpha sense spiking, sharp and defiant. "Who are you?" Troy asked, staring up at the chairman. "Why are you making my papa sad?" My father froze. For a split second, his mask slipped. He saw exactly what I saw. The perfect miniature image of the Sterling bloodline. A powerful, budding alpha with a gaze that didn't flinch. "He's nobody, Troy," I said, stepping forward and lifting him into my arms. I tucked him into the crook of my elbow, feeling his small heart racing against my chest. Just a man who lost his way. I turned back to my father, my alpha aura flaring so sharply that the chairman actually took a half step back. "Get out of my house. If you ever come near them again, if you even send a single lawyer to their door, I will liquidate every share I own and burn this company to the ground before I let you touch him." "You would destroy your legacy for a boy?" my father hissed. "He is my legacy," I said coldly. "Now leave." The elevator doors closed on my father's stunned face. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. James sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. "It's starting, Mark. He won't stop. He'll use the press. He'll use the board. We can't stay here." I sat beside him, still holding Troy, who was now curiously poking at the expensive watch on my wrist. "You're right," I said, my mind already spinning with a new plan. "He'll attack us where we're vulnerable. So we're going to give him something else to talk about." James looked up. "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow is the annual foundation gala," I said. "The entire city will be there. The press, the politicians, our rivals." I looked down at Troy, then back at James. "We aren't going to hide. I'm going to introduce my heir and my partner to the world. If we're going to fight a war, we'll do it in the light, where he can't hide in the shadows." Troy looked up from my watch, his eyes bright. "Is there going to be cake at the gala?" A small, genuine smile broke through my cold exterior. I pressed a kiss to the top of my son's head. "The biggest cake you've ever seen." Afternoon. Troy was finally asleep in the guest room, exhausted by the strange energy of the day. The penthouse was quiet, but the air felt heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I found James on the balcony. He wasn't looking at the view. He was huddled in a chair, his arms wrapped around his knees, looking small against the backdrop of the glowing city. "James," I started, stepping onto the cold marble. "Don't," he whispered. He didn't even turn around. "Don't act like you're the hero here, Mark. You didn't save us. You just hijacked our lives." The words bit. I walked to the railing, keeping my distance. "I was trying to protect you from my father. You saw him. He hasn't changed." "Neither have you," James said, finally looking at me. His eyes were red, but his voice was ice cold. "You still think you can just bark an order and the world will shift. You dragged us here. Did you once ask me what I wanted? Did you once ask if I even wanted to see your face again?" I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the words died in my throat. I looked at his hands, rougher than they used to be, the skin around his cuticles dry from years of hard work I hadn't shared. "I thought I was doing the right thing 4 years ago," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "I thought if I walked away, he would leave you alone. I thought I was protecting your future. My future was you." James stood up, his voice cracking with a pain that made my alpha core ache. "I spent nights wondering if I had done something wrong. I spent months mourning sick and alone, hiding in a basement apartment because I was terrified your father's men were following me. I had to sell my mother's jewelry to pay the hospital bill when Troy was born. Where were you when he had his first fever? Where were you when I had to choose between buying milk or paying the heating bill?" Every word felt like a physical blow. I had built skyscrapers while he was counting pennies for milk. I had been called a visionary while the father of my child was hiding in a basement. I stepped toward him, but he retreated. "I'm sorry," I said. It sounded pathetic, too small for the gravity of his suffering. "Sorry doesn't give me back 4 years," James spat, tears finally spilling over. "Sorry doesn't explain to Troy why he didn't have a father at his school plays. You stayed in your glass tower, Mark. You stayed comfortable. You didn't even look for us. I did, I growled, desperation leaking out. I looked, but my father wiped every trace. He told me you had moved abroad. He showed me fake records. I was a coward, James. I believed him because it was easier than facing the fact that I had let him win. I stayed in this tower because I was hollow without you. That's not an excuse. It's my shame. I sank to my knees on the cold balcony floor. The CEO of Sterling Group, the man the world feared, was on the ground at the feet of the Omega he had broken. I can't fix the last 4 years, I said, looking up at him. I can't buy back the nights you spent crying alone. But I am not my father's puppet anymore. I will spend every second of the rest of my life making it up to you. Not with money, not with apartments, but with the truth. I was a fool who didn't fight for you then. Please, let me fight for you now. James stared down at me, his chest heaving. The silence stretched for an eternity. He didn't tell me to get up. He didn't forgive me. You want to fight? James asked quietly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then prove it. Tomorrow at that gala. Don't you dare introduce us as your heir and your partner. If you want me to even consider staying in this house, you tell them the truth. Tell them you failed us. Tell them you're the one who doesn't deserve us. He turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone in the cold. I stayed on my knees for a long time. The cold CEO was gone. All that was left was a man who realized he didn't just have a son to win over. He had a soul to earn back. The nightmare came at 3 a.m. It wasn't a loud scream. It was a soft, frantic whimper that cut through the silence of the penthouse more effectively than any alarm. I was already awake, sitting in the dark of the living room, haunted by James's words on the balcony. We had decided to let Troy sleep in one of the guest rooms, the one next to mine. James was sleeping alone in the master bedroom. I reached the guest room door at the same time as James. He was wearing one of my old t-shirts he'd found in a drawer. It was 3 sizes too big for him, hanging loosely off his collarbone. In the dim hallway light, he looked exhausted, his protective Omega sense spiking with worry. He didn't look at me. He pushed past me, his focus entirely on the bed. Troy, baby, I'm here, James whispered, pulling the trembling 4-year-old into his lap. Troy was sobbing, his small hands clutching James's shirt. The big house. It was so cold, Papa. You weren't there. I couldn't find the door. My heart twisted. The boy was dreaming of this place. To me, it was a trophy of success. To him, it was a sterile, frightening labyrinth where he could lose his father. I hovered in the doorway, feeling like the intruder I was. Is he okay? He has these when he's stressed, James said. His voice clipped as he rocked the boy. New places, new people. It takes him time to feel safe. Troy looked up then, his eyes red and puffy. He saw me standing in the shadows. To my surprise, he didn't pull away. He reached out a small, shaky hand. Loud man, he snuffled. I walked over slowly, sinking onto the edge of the bed. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I was a man who gave commands, not comfort. But I reached out anyway and let Troy wrap his tiny fingers around my thumb. I'm here, Troy, I said, my voice cracking. Nobody is going to get lost. I'll leave all the lights on. I'll stand at the door if I have to. Troy stared at me, his little alpha instincts weighing my sincerity. Then he looked at James. Can we stay together? He asked quietly. Just until the sun comes? James stiffened. I saw the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to say no. He wanted to keep our worlds separate. But the fear in his son's eyes mattered more than his anger at me. Just until the sun, James murmured, shifting to make space on the large bed. I lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed, while James settled on the other side. Troy was tucked between us, the fragile bridge over the 4-year canyon I had dug. For a long time, there was only the sound of Troy's breathing as it slowed into sleep. The scent of the room changed. The sharp ozone of my guilt and the bitter plum of James's resentment softened, blending into something fragile and almost domestic. You're actually going to do it, aren't you? James's voice was a low thread in the dark. Do what? The gala. You're going to tell them you failed us. I am, I said, staring at the ceiling. I've already drafted the statement for the PR team. I'm not just introducing a child. I'm introducing the fact that I'm a man who doesn't deserve the family he has. My father will try to say I'm unstable. Let him. I'd rather be an unstable father than a stable CEO with an empty heart. I heard James shift. In the dark, I felt his hand brush against mine as he reached over to adjust Troy's blanket. For a second, his fingers lingered close to mine. He didn't pull away immediately. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, he whispered. Every time I look at him, I see the years you missed. I see the face of the man who left me when I needed him most. I know, I replied, my throat tight. I didn't know you were pregnant, but that doesn't excuse leaving you alone. I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. I'm just asking for a chance to be the man who stands in front of the door so the nightmares don't get in. James didn't respond, but he didn't move his hand away either. We stayed like that until the first gray light of a London morning bled through the curtains. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't waking up to a schedule or a stock report. I was waking up to the sound of my son's light snoring and the scent of the only man I had ever loved. The sun was up. The truce was over. But when James blinked awake and looked at me with a gaze that was just a fraction less cold than the night before, I knew the war was worth it. I'm going to take a bath, James said, sitting up and rubbing his face. James, I called as he headed for the door. He paused. Thank you for staying. He didn't look back, but his shoulders relaxed just an inch. I didn't do it for you, he said quietly. I did it for the version of you Troy thinks you are. Don't make him a liar. The morning was a blur of frantic phone calls and a surprisingly domestic breakfast that involved burnt toast and Troy explaining, in painstaking detail, the plot of his favorite cartoon. The fragile truce from the night before lingered, thin, almost invisible, but present, between James and me. We need to go, I said, checking my watch for the third time. The tailor is waiting. James looked up from wiping jam off Troy's face. The tailor? Mark, I have clothes. Not for the Sterling Foundation gala, you don't? I replied, my gaze sweeping over his faded sweater. This isn't just a party, James. This is a declaration of war. We need to look formidable. He glared at me, but the worry in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew my father wouldn't hold back. I took them to my private tailor, a hushed atelier tucked away in a quiet London alley. Monsieur Laurent, a meticulous old alpha with a measuring tape draped around his neck like a sacred scarf, greeted me with a deferential bow. He froze for a moment when he saw James, then his gaze sharpened, assessing the elegant lines hidden beneath worn fabric. Good morning, Mr. Sterling, Laurent said slowly, then inclined his head toward James. It seems we have urgent work to do. Troy, meanwhile, was fascinated by the bolts of silk and cashmere, attempting to climb into a display cabinet. Look, Papa. Sparkly. Laurent produced a miniature suit tailored to perfection. Navy blue, crisp, and unmistakably sterling. Troy's eyes went wide. He tried it on immediately, twirling in front of the mirror, looking like the smallest and most dangerous alpha heir in training. Then it was James's turn. Laurent rolled out a rack of options. James balked at the price tags. Mark, this is insane. I just need something presentable, not a second mortgage. You need to look like you belong at my side, I said firmly. Like you always belonged at my side. He chose a suit of deep forest green silk, a subtle rebellion against the expected black. The fabric hugged his lean frame, sharpening his grace into something powerful. As Laurent adjusted the lapels, James caught my eye in the mirror. He used to dress in soft, flowing fabrics that enhanced his omega elegance. Now, wrapped in tailored authority, he looked breathtaking, dangerous, like an omega who could bring an alpha CEO to his knees without raising his voice. His scent shifted, still plum soft, but threaded with defiance. It suits you, I said, my voice rougher than intended. He gave a faint, sardonic smile. It's a costume, Mark. Don't mistake it for a transformation. While Laurent finished the fittings, James stepped away from the mirrors, fingers fidgeting with his cuff. You're doing this to make a statement to your father, aren't you? To show him you can still choose. Partly, I admitted, watching Troy attempt to steal a button off a velvet jacket. And partly because I remember how beautiful you are when you're not hiding. James's gaze softened, just for a heartbeat, before the walls slid back into place. Don't, he said quietly. We're doing this for Troy. That's all. We left the atelier carrying garment bags. As we drove back toward the penthouse, a news alert flashed across the dashboard screen. Sterling Global CEO Mark Sterling spotted with mysterious Omega and child in London. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable, me carrying Troy, James just behind us. The speculation had already begun. James inhaled sharply. They're already hounding us. We should stay home, Mark. He's just a child. It's too late to hide, I said, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. And my father knows that. This isn't just about showing Troy to the world. It's about showing the world that no one touches my family. Not even him. Troy, blissfully unaware, pressed his face to the window. Papa, look, a huge tiger. I followed his gaze to a massive billboard. A cartoon tiger grinning down at the city. My son, my hidden heir, about to walk into a den of real predators. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into battle alone. I was bringing my most precious weapons with me. The Sterling Foundation Gala was held at the Natural History Museum. Usually, the sight of the Victorian architecture and the grand, soaring arches brought me a sense of peace. Tonight, it felt like a battlefield. As our black SUV pulled into the arrivals lane, the flashbulbs began to go off like stuttering lightning. Stay close to me, I commanded, my voice dropping into that low, protective alpha register. James was sitting in the back, his hand gripped tightly around Troy's. He looked regal in the forest green silk, but I could smell his anxiety. The plum blossoms were sharp, almost sour with fear. I can't do this, Mark, he whispered, staring at the swarm of reporters held back by velvet ropes and security. You aren't doing it alone, I said, reaching back and firmly taking his hand. I squeezed it until he met my eyes. Look at Troy. Look how brave he is. Troy was currently pressed against the window, mesmerized by the flashing lights. Are we superheroes, Papa? James let out a shaky breath and managed a small, sad smile for his son. Something like that, baby. The door was opened by a white-gloved attendant. I stepped out first, the cool London air hitting me. I didn't wait. I turned and reached into the car, lifting Troy out. The boy looked like a miniature aristocrat in his navy suit, his dark hair perfectly swept back. Then I reached for James. When he stepped onto the pavement, the noise from the press reached a fever pitch. Mr. Sterling, is the child yours? Who is the Omega, Mark? Is this the secret heir to the Sterling Group? I didn't answer them. I placed my hand firmly on the small of James's back, guiding him past the wall of cameras. I felt him trembling, but he kept his head high, his jaw set in that defiant line I was beginning to realize was his greatest strength. We entered the great hall. The cavernous room was filled with the elite of board members, rival CEOs, and old money aristocrats. The hum of 100 conversations died instantly as we walked in. It was a silence so heavy it felt physical. And there, at the end of the hall, beneath the skeleton of the giant whale, stood my father. He didn't look angry. He looked smug. He was surrounded by the most powerful members of the board, and he held a glass of champagne like a scepter. I walked straight up to him, not stopping until we were mere inches apart. I didn't let go of James, and I didn't put Troy down. For the first time in my life, I stood before my father without lowering my gaze. Mark, he said smoothly, eyes flicking to the child in my arms. You've caused quite a scene. That was the idea, I replied. His smile tightened. You should have handled this privately. I did, I said. 4 years ago, you handled it for me. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Whispers rippled outward like cracks in glass. Troy leaned closer to my neck, his small hand gripping my collar. Loud man, he whispered. That man is staring. I kissed his temple. Ignore him. You're doing great. James's fingers dug into my sleeve. I could feel the tremor running through him, but he didn't step back. He didn't hide. He stood at my side, exactly where he belonged. My father lifted his glass slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, projecting his voice, "shall we enjoy the evening? The foundation." "No," I interrupted. The word echoed. Sharp. Final. Every eye in the hall snapped to me. "This gala exists because the Sterling Foundation claims to protect families, children, and futures," I said, my voice carrying without effort. "Tonight, I'm here to admit that for 4 years, I failed at all 3. James sucked in a breath. My father's eyes darkened. "Mark, I wasn't finished." Silence fell again, deeper than before. "I was told the Omega I loved had disappeared," I continued. "I was shown lies, fabricated records, and instead of fighting harder, I believed them. That failure is mine, not his." I turned slightly, angling my body so James and Troy were fully visible. "This is James," I said clearly. "He is not a secret. He is not a mistake. He is the man who raised my son alone while I hid behind a boardroom table." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "And this?" I said, adjusting my grip as Troy looked out over the sea of faces. "Is Troy Sterling, my son, my heir." The room exploded. Voices overlapped. Cameras flashed. Shock, disbelief, outrage, fascination. My father slammed his cane against the marble floor. "This is madness," he snapped. "You are destroying everything I built." I finally looked back at him, truly looked. "No," I said calmly. "You're watching me build something you can't control." I felt James straighten beside me. His fear hadn't vanished, but it had transformed, hardened into resolve. "You threatened him," I continued, my alpha aura rolling outward, heavy and unmistakable. "You threatened to take his child. You used your power to terrorize an Omega into silence." The board members stared at my father now, not me. "That ends tonight." My father's voice dropped to a hiss. "You think the board will stand by you after this?" I glanced around the hall, at the cameras, at the donors, at the public stage he could no longer manipulate quietly. "They already have," I said. "Because if they don't, they explain why they sided with a man who tried to steal his own grandson." Troy chose that moment to tug on my collar. He whispered loudly, "Are we done? I want cake." A stunned laugh broke through the tension. One person laughed, then another. The spell cracked. I smiled, actually smiled, and pressed my forehead briefly to his. Almost kid. I looked back at James. This was the moment he had demanded. I tightened my hold on Troy and turned fully to the crowd again. "I am not asking for forgiveness," I said. "I am stating the truth. I failed this family once. I will not fail them again. Anyone who has a problem with that," I met my father's gaze, "can take it up with me." Security shifted. Board members murmured. Power realigned. Right there on the museum floor beneath the bones of something ancient and unyielding. James's hand slid into mine. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull away. He stayed. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. Not the tense silence of the journey to the gala, but the heavy, ringing quiet that follows an explosion. Troy was asleep within minutes, his head a trusting weight on James's lap, chocolate cake smudged on the corner of his mouth. James stared out the window, his hand absently stroking our son's hair. He hadn't let go of my hand since we left the museum floor. My phone had been vibrating incessantly in my pocket for 20 minutes. I finally silenced it without looking. It didn't matter. The headlines were already writing themselves in my mind. Sterling heir unveiled in museum meltdown. CEO's secret family. Scandal or soap opera. Chairman Sterling implicated in Omega intimidation. The last one was the only one that mattered. Henry pulled the car into the private underground garage. The elevator ride-up felt longer than the entire evening. "I'll put him to bed," James said softly, hefting Troy into his arms. The boy mumbled, nuzzling into his father's neck. I just nodded, my body humming with a strange, volatile energy. Part triumph, part dread. The battle was won. The war was just beginning. I went to my study. The wall of screens that usually showed global markets was now a cacophony of news channels. Every single one had a photo of us. James's defiant profile, Troy in my arms, my father's frozen snarl. The narrative was chaotic, but the image was clear. A dynasty cracking down the middle. My private line rang. Not the phone. The secure, encrypted landline only 3 people had the number for. I picked it up. "You arrogant, sentimental fool." My father's voice was stripped of all its society smoothness. It was pure, ragged fury. "You think a pretty speech and a child's tantrum changes anything? You've made the company a laughingstock. I've made the truth inescapable." I replied, my voice calm. I was surprised by how calm. "The board has already seen the evidence Peter compiled. The bank transfers to your consultants who track James. The recorded threats from your lawyer. It's over." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. He hadn't expected me to move that fast. The cold CEO had been preparing this counterstrike for years, waiting for the right weapon. James and Troy weren't my weakness. They were my catalyst. "You have until 9 a.m. to resign from the board and publicly endorse me as chairman," I continued, the words clinical. "If you do, you'll keep your pension and the estate in Sussex. If you don't, I release everything to the financial regulators and the press. You won't go to jail. You'll just cease to exist in the world you built. Your choice." The line went dead. I sat in the dark, the glow of the screens painting my hands blue. I felt no victory, just a vast, hollow fatigue. A soft sound at the door made me turn. James stood there, still in his suit jacket, though he'd lost the tie. He looked young and impossibly weary. "He called?" James asked. "Yes." And I gave him a choice, a graceful exit or oblivion. James walked into the room, his gaze skimming over the frenetic news channels before he came to stand before me. He didn't sit. "You didn't do that for me." "I did it because of you," I corrected, looking up at him. "But no, I did it for him." I nodded toward the hallway, where Troy slept. "So he never has to make a phone call like that. So the Sterling name means something he can be proud of, not something he has to hide from." James was silent for a long moment. "What happens now?" "Now?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "The real work starts. The board will demand a meeting tomorrow. The stock will plummet at opening. Our rivals will smell blood. I'll have to spend the next 6 months rebuilding trust, proving this doesn't make me weak, but human." I said the word like it was a foreign concept. "And us?" The question was a whisper. I stood up. We were close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, see the faint tremble in his lower lip he was trying so hard to control. "You have every right to take him and walk out that door," I said, my voice rough. "The trust fund I set up for Troy is irrevocable. You'll never want for anything. You can live anywhere in the world, far from this mess." "Is that what you want?" he challenged, but his eyes were searching mine, vulnerable. "It is the last thing I want," I confessed, the truth torn from me. "I want you to stay. I want to wake up and make him pancakes. I want to argue with you about the color of the sofa. I want to build a life, not a legacy. But wanting isn't enough. I have to earn it, and I don't know how to start." James looked down. When he spoke again, his voice was thick. "Troy asked me a question tonight, after the cake. He asked if the loud man was his other papa now." My breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." James looked up, and his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Because he is. Biology doesn't care about our history. You are his father. And he wants to build a pillow fort with you." A choke sound escaped me, half laugh, half sob. Pillow fort. The heir to a billion-pound empire wanted a pillow fort. "So," James continued, swiping at his cheek with a quick, angry motion, "you start by building a pillow fort. You start by being there for his next nightmare. You start by coming home before dark. You start by asking me what I want, not telling me what you'll provide." He took a step closer, invading my space not with aggression, but with a fragile, terrifying hope. "I don't want your penthouse, Mark. I want a home. I don't want your money. I want your time. I don't want the CEO. I want the man who knelt on a balcony because he finally understood what he'd lost." I reached for him then, my hands coming up to cradle his face. He didn't flinch. "I am that man," I vowed, my forehead leaning against his. "I am so desperately sorry, and I am so desperately yours if you'll have me." He didn't answer with words. He closed the last inch between us and kissed me. It wasn't like the kisses of 4 years ago, all youthful fire and desperation. This was salt and tears, forgiveness and fear, a promise and a question. It was the first stitch in a wound that had been bleeding for 4 years. When we broke apart, we were both shaking. "The board meeting is at 7 a.m., I murmured against his lips. "Then you should get some sleep," he whispered back, his arms sliding around my waist, holding on as if I were the anchor in his storm. "I can't," I said. "I'm building a pillow fort." For the first time in 4 years, James smiled at me. A real, true, breathtaking smile that reached his eyes. It felt like the sun rising after the longest, coldest night. "Okay," he said, "but I'm in charge of the blankets." Outside, the city glittered, indifferent. The headlines scrolled, relentless. The empire trembled. And in the sterile marble heart of the penthouse, we began to build something that could finally, truly, be called a home. The board meeting was not a battle. It was a surrender. They had expected a defensive, rattled CEO. They received the new chairman, calm, prepared, and wielding a quiet, absolute authority that had nothing to do with my alpha aura and everything to do with the file in front of each of them. The file contained two things. The first part was the evidence against my father, the financial trails, the legally dubious threats, the proof of a systematic campaign of intimidation. It was cold, hard, and damning. The second part was a single photograph. Troy, asleep on the floor of my study just before dawn, buried under a mountain of pillows and cashmere blankets from the so-called fort. One small hand clutching the tail of my discarded tie. He was smiling in his sleep. I didn't reference the photo. I didn't have to. My predecessor's actions were a liability this company can no longer afford. I stated, my voice echoing in the silent, wood-paneled room. They were also a personal betrayal. Moving forward, Sterling Global will operate with transparency. Our legacy will be built on integrity, not intimidation. Any questions? The oldest member of the board, a beta woman named Eleanor Shaw who had never approved of my father's methods, was the first to speak. She closed her file and looked not at the documents, but at the photo. "The boy," she said. "He'll need security. The best. Discreet." "It's already arranged," I said. She nodded, a sharp, final gesture. "Then I see no further questions." I moved to ratify Mark Sterling's position as executive chairman, and to accept the immediate resignation of Arthur Sterling from all company roles. The vote was unanimous. When I left the boardroom at 7:45 a.m., the structure of my old life had been formally dismantled. The structure of my new one was waiting, fragile and utterly real. I found them in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, a room I had never used. Troy was in a fresh set of dinosaur pajamas, explaining to a very serious-looking James how the Brachiosaurus was the best dinosaur because it had the longest neck for reaching the pancake leaves. James looked up as I entered. He was wearing soft, gray sweatpants and one of my old university sweaters, the collar stretched out. He looked at home. The sight of it sent a shockwave through my system more profound than any boardroom coup. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes gave him away. They were wide with concern for me. "It's done," I said, walking over. I bent down and pressed a kiss to the top of Troy's head. Then, before I could second-guess it, I turned and kissed James softly on the lips. A good morning kiss, a domestic kiss. It lasted only a second, but it felt more significant than any statement I'd made to the press. James's cheeks flushed a faint pink. Troy giggled. "Papa, your face is red." "Hush, you," James muttered. But he was smiling as he turned back to the stove. I sat down, and a plate of slightly lopsided, chocolate chip pancakes was set in front of me. They were objectively a mess. They were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "We have to go back today," James said quietly, sitting opposite me with his tea. "To the apartment. We need our things. And I have to quit my jobs properly." The real world, with its mundane logistics, was intruding. It was a relief. We'll go together, I said. All of us. The studio apartment was a physical punch to the gut. It was clean and bright, filled with plants and Troy's drawings taped to the walls, but it was also undeniably small. The ceiling was low. I could see the careful patches on the sofa, the second-hand books stacked neatly, the single, proud framed award for Freelance Designer of the Year on the mantel. This was where they had lived, where James had raised our son, where he'd counted pennies and fought off nightmares alone. While James spoke softly on the phone in the bedroom, explaining his situation to a client, I wandered. Troy dragged me to his room, a closet-sized space barely fitting a tiny bed and a chest of toys. "This is Mr. Snuffles," he said, shoving a well-loved stuffed badger into my hands. "He protects from monsters. You can hold him if you get scared in the big house." I knelt, the badger in my hands. "Thank you, Troy. I might need him." He nodded sagely. "Papa needs him more, but you can share." From the other room, I heard James's voice, weary but firm. "I understand it's short notice, Mrs. Alcott, but my circumstances have changed. Yes, permanently." He was giving up the life he'd built, the independence he'd fought for me, for this uncertain, sprawling future I offered. When he came out, his eyes were tired but clear. "Okay, let's pack." We worked in a quiet, efficient tandem. I folded Troy's small clothes with a focus usually reserved for merger documents. James packed his design portfolio, his hands lingering on the edges. It wasn't just things we were boxing up. It was a past life. As I lifted a box of books, a small, leather-bound journal slipped from between the pages of a design annual and fell to the floor, splaying open. I didn't mean to look, but my eyes caught the date point 4 years ago. The handwriting was James's, but frantic, shaky. "He's gone. His father's men came. They said Mark chose the company. They said I'd ruin him if I stayed. I have to believe it's for the best. But it feels like dying. Positive. 2 lines. I'm terrified. I have no one. Troy was born today. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He has his father's frown. He's perfect. I've never been so alone. Mark." I looked up. James was standing in the doorway of the small bedroom, his face pale. He'd seen what I was holding. I gently closed the journal, as if it were a wounded bird, and held it out to him. My throat was too tight to speak. He took it, clutching it to his chest. "You weren't supposed to see that." "I'm glad I did," I rasped. "I needed to see it." He looked at the boxes, at the empty shelves, at our son carefully placing his toys in a crate. "It was a hard life," he said finally, "but it was ours. And it was real. I don't want to erase it," I said, taking a step toward him. "I want to build on it. With you." The last box was sealed. We stood in the middle of the empty room, the ghosts of 4 difficult years whispering around us. James took a final, slow look, then turned to me and held out his hand. "Take us home, Mark." The word home didn't mean the penthouse. It meant the thing we were slowly, painstakingly building. That night, after Troy was asleep, with Mr. Snuffles positioned strategically between us, James and I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The vast city glittered beyond the glass, but the center of the universe had shrunk to this small circle of lamplight. "What do you want, James?" I asked him the question I had failed to ask for 4 years. "Not for Troy. For you." He leaned his head against my shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound it made my heart ache. "I want to design," he said softly. "Not just freelance jobs. I want to create something that's mine. Maybe even for the company. A new line. Something beautiful and accessible. Not cold." I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him closer. "Then that's what you'll do. The Sterling Design Wing. You'll be the creative director. The first project is making the penthouse look less like a museum." He laughed, a soft, watery sound. "It's a start." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the lights of London, 2 wounded souls amidst the boxes of a shared past, finally facing the same future. Morning came softly, not with alarms or urgent calls, but with pale London light filtering through the sheer curtains and the distant hum of the city waking up without us. I woke first. For a moment I didn't move. I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow, even breaths beside me and the smaller, deeper sleep sounds coming from the pillow fort at the foot of the bed. James was curled on his side, facing me. His hair was mussed, his face bare of defenses, the lines of worry smoothed away by sleep. One of his hands rested loosely against my chest, as if he'd reached for me sometime in the night without waking. The sight of it hit harder than any headline ever had. This was what I'd almost lost forever. A muffled rustle came from the fort, then a small, sleepy voice. "Papa, I'm hungry." James stirred, blinking. I was already sitting up. "I've got it," I said quietly. He studied my face for a second, then nodded and lay back down, relief softening his expression. Trust, given without words. I padded into the kitchen, still barefoot, still half afraid this would vanish if I moved too fast. Troy followed, dragging his blanket behind him like a royal train. "What do you want?" I asked him. He thought hard. "Pancakes, but not the burnt ones." "That's fair." By the time James joined us, the kitchen smelled like butter and coffee. Troy was perched on a stool, supervising with great seriousness. James leaned against the counter, watching us. He didn't speak at first. "You don't look like a man about to run a global corporation," he said finally. I flipped a pancake. "I'm multitasking." He smiled. Not the careful smile. Not the guarded one. The real one. After breakfast, we sat together on the sofa. Crumbs, blankets, Troy wedged between us with a picture book open on his lap. "I have school today, right, Daddy?" Troy announced. James stiffened instinctively. I felt it and spoke before the fear could take root. "He'll go. Safely. Same routine. Extra security you won't even notice." James searched my face. "No press. None. No bodyguards in his classroom?" "Discreet ones, far away." Troy looked between us. "Am I in trouble?" James immediately pulled him close. "No, baby. Never." I added softly, "You're just important." Troy considered that, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "Okay." Later, after Troy left with the driver and his backpack nearly bigger than he was, the penthouse felt quieter. Not empty, just open. James wandered through the living room, touching things thoughtfully. The walls, the shelves, the light. "This place still doesn't feel like mine," he said honestly. "It doesn't have to," I replied. "Not yet. We can change it, or leave it, or leave here altogether." He turned to me. "You'd do that?" "Yes." No hesitation. No conditions. Silence stretched between us. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. "I stayed for Troy," James said at last. That was the truth. But I'm not staying only for him anymore. My breath caught. "I'm scared," he continued, "of trusting you, of losing myself again, of waking up one day and realizing I disappeared into your world." "You won't," I said quietly. "I won't let that happen." He stepped closer. "That's not your promise to make alone." I nodded. "Then I'll keep proving it. Every day. Until you believe me." He studied me for a long moment, then reached out and took my hand. "Okay," he said. One word. A beginning. That evening we picked Troy up together. He ran toward us without hesitation, crashing into my legs, then James's. "Papa, can we make the fort bigger tonight?" James laughed. "Bigger? With chairs," Troy added. "And snacks." I looked at James. "What do you say, creative director?" He rolled his eyes fondly. "I say the structural integrity will be questionable." We built it anyway. Later, after Troy fell asleep inside it, Mr. Snuffles clutched protectively under one arm. James and I lay side by side on the floor, staring up at the ceiling through the gaps in the blankets. "This isn't perfect," James murmured. "No," I agreed. "It's real." He turned his head toward me. "Stay." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. It was a choice. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. Outside, the city continued. Loud, ruthless, unchanged. Inside, beneath a crooked fortress of blankets and trust, we finally had something stronger than legacy. We had home.